Welcome to a bonus episode of the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast. I think you'll be intrigued by these bonus episodes, which center on the Summer Institute in Teaching Science, also known as SITS, which I founded back in 2003 and which I continue to direct to the present. SITS is devoted to faculty and curriculum development. Nearly all the faculty of the Division of Natural Science at Bob Jones University have been through this intensive, one-of-a-kind program, which requires 4 10-week summers to complete. In these bonus episodes, we'll take a look at what has made SITS so transformational, both for our faculty and our curriculum. Well, we're joined today by a colleague of mine in the biology department, Dr. David McKinney, who is going to talk to us about the process of preparing faculty for the classroom. David is a graduate of our undergraduate program, has a PhD from University of Georgia in entomology, and returned on faculty a few years back, and in fact last summer finished the 4th summer of SITS. So I've asked David to kind of reflect on that opportunity that he's had for 4 years. Certainly after completing SITS, which in one sense is never done. We actually have him do a little bit of teaching this summer. But in terms of formally completing the 4 tracks in the intervening school years in between, he's taught and worked to apply principles of teaching and learning that he acquired there. David, since you are an undergraduate here, maybe without explicitly knowing it, maybe because of the grapevine, maybe you did know, you experienced some SITS modeled teaching from faculty members in the Division of Natural Science. So in what sense were you aware that something different was going on in those classrooms? And maybe how did that contrast with what it felt like coming back as a faculty member and being explicitly instructed about what had been going on and what continues to go on in our classrooms?
Yeah, so you come in an undergrad and you come into college, and most of the time I would say accurately that the average person hasn't thought about their own thinking. You come in without even an awareness of what we call metacognition, thinking about true thinking. And so you're in the classroom and you feel like some classes work for you and some don't, some teachers you like and some you don't. And maybe that's personality, but there's also a sense in which you may not like a class because you don't understand what's going on. And so when I came into biology, I could see that there was a very clear difference between my biology classes, my science classes, and my other classes. And I didn't know what the difference was. I just knew that I really liked my science classes, even if the subject was hard, even if I didn't do well. But the other classes were hit or miss. You never knew. If I'm taking English, I might like it, I might not. And I grappled with that the first year. And then I started to hear about the SITS program as an undergrad student. And I began to see there was this pattern of difference. There was an intentionality to coursework, to classes in the natural sciences that made them more conducive to learning, my own learning. And so going through that, by the time I was a senior, I was very much aware and committed to a model of teaching that I couldn't necessarily put words to, but that was what was modeled from the SITS program. And so coming back and starting the SITS program, I could see why it was modeled the way it was, and what was done was application of what was taught in our SITS training in the summer. So to me, it felt very natural, it fit, and I was eager for that. Now there's a downside, there's always a dark side. And the dark side was that the more SITS was modeled in the classroom, the less satisfied I was with classes that were not using a SITS type of learning model, where here's the facts, know the facts, come back and do well on the test, and that's learning. And it's very dissatisfying because you get this set of things that is interesting, but you can't remember. I remember history of Civ here on campus. I took 2 semesters, general introduction to history. I, in the first semester, missed 3 points of the entire course. So I got about as high as you can get academically. And the second semester, I think, only missed 5 points of the entire course. How much of that course do I remember? Very little. And it's unfortunate because I enjoyed the course. I liked the teacher. But the gain long term, there was no gain. 2 years later, I couldn't tell you anything. Names, dates, couldn't tell you that. And it's because it was taught with this fact recall. Here's a list of facts. If you know these facts, and then here's the test, which fact fits with which question. And so even though I liked it, it was dissatisfying because I gained nothing from it. What was the point of the experience? Just to show up? Whereas in my biology classes, I still have very clear memories and understanding of particular topics from General Biology 1 that I still draw upon. Now, I suppose it's unfair to make that comparison because I'm a biology major, or I was an undergrad. But at the same time, I think there's a difference at the level of how it was taught that gave me a buy-in to the whole SITS model, that I come into the SITS model that first summer back as faculty, and I was ready. I was interested. I wanted to know, how does this work? How do I do this? How do I emulate this? So you could say, coming into SITS, I had a form, a sense of a form, but I didn't know what it looked like. And so that would be entry point into SITS and how the model compares from undergrad, my experience with people who had SITS training, versus my starting the training myself.
So let me just interject for the sake of historical perspective that history has changed markedly since David was an undergraduate here. It's now a 1-semester course and focused very differently, I think because of some sensitivity to the exact thing that David has identified here. Before we move into the process of changing minds, if they need to be changed, about teaching and learning that's part of SITS, talking about a pattern may scare some people. A pattern for teaching may make it sound like cookie cutter approach, like teachers have to check their personalities and gifts at the door and simply adopt a perspective that may fit intuitively some people's view of what should go on in the classroom, and for others it might be a real strain, like it never feels natural, but that's what's expected. And contrary to when I was a young faculty member, there actually are observations of faculty in the classroom, and that's how we play the game here. So is there any sense in which you had the feeling as an undergraduate, or got the feeling in the instructional process in SITS, that we were asking you to fit within the parameters of an unnatural template?
No, I would say not at all. There is a sense of, I think, in SITS and in the model, there's a sense in which it's hard to get clarity on, say, limits. Like, how far can you go in a particular style or form before it becomes ineffective? And I think we have disagreement amongst us about exactly what that looks like. But other than that, I would say, yeah, there's no pressure to be, you must teach like so-and-so. You must conform to a particular style of instruction, of testing. I think there's a lot of freedom within the model to fit your personality, your skill set, what you're good at, what you're not good at, and where you're trying to go with your particular subject. It's constraining, but it's not a constraint that's unnatural. It's a constraint that says we're trying to do what works best for the way we are created. We're trying to do what's best for the way we have our structured time and our classes, and for our personalities. And the limit is more like, if you exceed that, your design, as it were, you lose efficacy in your teaching. You're missing, not because you're a bad teacher per se, but because you're using poor methods, or you're beyond the limit of what people have capacities for. So in undergrad, amongst the natural sciences here, I didn't feel like everybody was a cookie cutter. Everybody had their own personality. And it would be actually difficult to say, for me personally, from an undergrad perspective, who had more time in SITS and who didn't. Now, I could tell who was more committed to the SITS model and who wasn't. There were some people who were committed to an older model of teaching facts, and you could tell. It showed, and it showed in our learning experience for undergrads. But for the most part, there wasn't this clear delineation. You had to work at it to determine who was actually leading the SITS model versus who had been involved but wasn't thoroughly on board or hadn't had as much time in training. And then again, we look around, those of us who finished recently, there was a biology person, a chemistry person, and engineering people, and I think there was a lot of room for flexibility. I didn't hear a lot of people were like, well, now I have to give up my preferred form or style, whatever it might be. So no, I don't think there was a form or cookie cutter form that forced people to jettison their natural bent or talents.
So you referred to, can't quote you, but something on the order of instruction that cooperates with the way we're made. Are you talking about teachers, or are you talking about the way learners are made and the learning process is designed to proceed?
I was thinking more in terms of the learning process.
Okay.
The design of the brain, the way we acquire information, the way we remember. You can teach in ways that are not conducive for the way we work, biologically speaking, neurologically speaking. And if you do that, you're fighting uphill. You're making learning unnecessarily difficult. And I was speaking of that in terms of that's one of the limits, that if I exceed that or go over that edge, then whatever I'm doing in the classroom is not as effective as it could be because I'm making it harder, whether I mean to or not. So that's what I was speaking.
Okay, so let's talk about the way in which the thinking of the teacher needs to change. And in fact, maybe we should just talk very briefly for overview purposes about the overall structure of SITS, which we often call a three-legged stool. Would you like to elaborate on that?
So the structure has to do with focusing on, you said the three-legged stool, which is focusing on clear thinking, clear communication, and clear assessment, or as we would say, substantive assessment. Not that the assessment instructions are clear, but that they're asking for more than memory of a fact or detail. And in that structure, it works out if you can't think clearly about your own discipline.
You being the teacher.
How could you expect students to think clearly about it? Or even how would you know? And so once you have a sense of how do I think clearly about my own ideas, my own discipline, the next phase of the SITS program would be, how do I communicate that effectively and clearly? Because we're all aware, at least in the sciences, that there's a commonality of great intellect paired with terrible communication. So, and stereotypes, but there's a reason for them. So anyway, so that becomes the next phase of the SITS model. And then we end with, okay, I can think clearly, I've communicated clearly, but how do I know that the students grappled with it well? How do I know they actually gained? How do I know that it's working, if I say it that way? And that's where assessment becomes vital. And it's so easy to ask simple questions that have non-thinking answers, and also so difficult to write deep and probing types of questions or assessments. And so we focus on that for a period of time. Now, it's unfortunate because of the way the universe works that we have to handle these three things 3 separate times, but they all go together. They all occur in the classroom in a sense simultaneously. And I would say that's probably the biggest challenge, that once you're done with the SITS model, trying to incorporate all three thoughtfully without being overwhelmed, and we talk about it, it becomes a dilemma.
The three-legged stool somehow got translated into 4 summers. So the first 2 summers deal with producing clear-thinking teachers. And I think those who are responsible for designing SITs have been sensitive to the possibility of creating offense. I think it would be helpful to address the fact that 2 summers are probably actually needed for that process to occur, and what exactly is meant by clear thinking. Are we accusing you of something? In some sense, isn't it automatic that somebody who's just successfully defended their dissertation is on top, particularly with oral comprehensive exams and so forth? They're on top of their field more than anybody here, and we hired them for their expertise. So how does clear thinking teaching, clear thinking teachers intersect you, and how do you avoid the offense, or maybe it was never offensive to you?
So for me personally, it wasn't particularly offensive, partially because I would recognize that I had my own issues in clear thinking. So probably we need back. What do we mean by clear thinking? As I understand it, going through the SITS model, it wasn't a matter of not thinking. It was a matter of understanding thinking itself. That for most of us who get PhDs, it's natural. We didn't get a PhD because we wanted to know how to think. We knew how to think, so we got a PhD. But we didn't necessarily, and I would be part of this, didn't necessarily understand, again, metacognition, thinking about thinking. And so clear thinking becomes, how did you get there? How did you arrive at the place where you understand? And the intent of thinking about that is, how will I get other people to arrive at a similar place? How do we teach, as we say, expert thinking to non-experts? Because for us, it's automatic. We talk often about the curse of knowledge. I know, but I do not remember what it is like not to know. Maybe I cannot remember, and thus it becomes difficult to, how do I get somebody to that place if I don't even know how I got there myself? And so the clarity comes on the part of, how do we think, and how do we arrive at that place, and how do we equip other people to think, and less on the, do I know all the stuff of my discipline? Rather, do I see the structure of my discipline, or is it all automatic? So working through that, and I think the break into 2 summers, like you said, is a natural thing, partially because we have to overcome the stigma of, well, do I really need clear thinking? I mean, like you said, there's a stigma there, but there's also a sense of, I made it with the methods my teachers used.
Yep.
And most of us, even here where we have a SITS model, we still had a lot of classes where that wasn't used. And in graduate school, there were still classes where that wasn't used. And I made it anyway, so isn't that enough? And so you have to overcome that. You have to establish, why does this matter? And so I think that takes part of the time, is laying a foundation that says, this is why this matters. This is why we can objectively say, there's a reason for this. There's a value here. And you have to lay that whole groundwork. I never saw any of that until I started SITS training. People didn't talk about metacognition. They just assumed it. Nobody talked about the patterns of thought that show up in my discipline or other disciplines. They were just assumed. And you either got the pattern and did well, or you didn't get the pattern and washed out. And nobody talked about why that might be, or how do we fix such a problem. Obviously, at the graduate level, there was less of the washing out. But still, it was disconcerting to see people who had capacities and abilities, who had a challenge and they couldn't articulate what the challenge was or how to overcome it. And the answer had to do with metacognition. How are you thinking about thinking? How are you thinking about your own thinking? And I think that becomes such an important piece that it takes time to lay that foundation. Thus, again, why is it 2 summers, not 1? It's not that the other legs are unimportant. It's that there's so much more to say that's complex and hard to grapple with about the first one, that it does take that time. And that people were saying, well, if you cover this in 1 summer, it's just overwhelming. You don't have the time it takes to process such difficult ideas as, how do I think about my own thinking?
Yeah, in some sense, what we discovered was trying to make it happen in one summer was actually violating some of our SITS principles about cognitive overload. And so we could press on and have the sessions that on paper would make this likely to happen, but it was not respecting what we were anticipating would be going on in the brain of most of the new faculty members. So there is a tendency to throw sessions at a problem rather than work with a pace that allows full understanding with the caveats that may be occurring in my mind as I'm receiving something that's foreign. Because it is true, it's universally recognized, that teachers tend to teach as those who taught them who were most effective at reaching them taught. And so there is a struggle to teach in any other way. In essence, you've already set a default that you've internalized and you've lived as a student, and now you're kind of vicariously tending to live in that way as a faculty member because you know how that works because you experienced it. And being on the other side and entertaining that there might actually be a much better way that is in harmony with the way the brain actually learns new ideas and puts them into a framework is difficult to make your mind, I guess, render judgment on your default and perhaps say it's been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and I really could help my students much more if I were more aware of the structure, the cognitive structure of my own discipline. Like I've internalized it, it's implicit to me, but implicit to me does not really help the students except for the rare student who detects what's implicit and begins to see a pattern. That's a high order expectation for an undergraduate. So we're really asking faculty and the clear thinking teachers 2 summers, we're asking them to unpack their discipline cognitively, knowing that they understand their discipline. They've been credentialed and it wasn't for nothing. But now their expertise needs to serve the students in their classroom rather than an accrediting agency that's looking for credentials or a student who wants to be sure that this person who's teaching me knows what they're talking about, that this person actually has worked metacognitively to take apart their discipline and highlight pieces that need to come first, that are more foundational than other pieces of the discipline, and move forward. So everything else is an implementation of that reality. So the other 2 legs, in essence, is this an exercise that I enjoy as a teacher, but it actually never comes through in the structure of my course? Well, that's what track 2 is all about. Like, it needs to live and breathe in the environment in which the students are encountering ideas, and I need to follow through, rather than this is something I do metacognitively to prepare for class. But then students may not even be aware that I've done this work, and I'm not really helping them like I could because I haven't helped them to internalize a metacognitive process while they're learning and internalizing ideas. So 2 summers is what we've discovered is most likely to mean that when I design curriculum, which on one level has been happening all the way through. I mean, the reality is you're going to a classroom in the fall, even after your first summer of SITS.
Yep.
That there comes a point where we've gotten a critical mass about metacognition that we can now say, this is going to govern the way I design my course, which is really the clear communication. It's not simply a matter of I use the right words and I don't overpower students and,
Yes.
and so forth. So you want to talk about curriculum design for a little bit here. So clear thinking, maybe what are the components of clear thinking that actually lead to an intentional curriculum that's going to maximize metacognition for the student?
Sure. So, focusing on the curriculum design, we're talking about looking for the big ideas, what is central to the discipline versus what is periphery, which is important because for a novice, for a student coming in, they see stuff and they can't tell what of the stuff is central and crucial and what is just facts or details that matter in context, but they are not the context. So designing curriculum such that it's about the principles, it's about the big ideas, it's about the central questions, and not about the stuff, not about the items at the end of the list, if we say it that way. So concept mapping and preparing a structure, a large structure that's like the skeleton. It's not something that will show up necessarily to the student. I suppose if the student studied the course syllabus, which no student does, they might be able to see that there is a plan here. But usually that's not what's seen, but it's necessary to make what you actually do in the classroom serve the bigger purpose, and you're not just working through a textbook, you're not just repeating, well, everybody knows this factoid, but that's the low value, that's the, maybe it's necessary to start thinking, but it's not what you think. The thinking is more than that. So preparing curriculum, at least in the first part of the first leg of the stool, we're talking about building this framework from which you will work outward of the curriculum where you're going, driven by questions, driven by the big ideas, the principles which have power across the discipline, and they're not just a one-off, well, flowers are blue because of this pigment. Well, that's nice, but what does that tell me about, plant biology in general? Nothing really. So yeah, that's a lot of it is a lot of work that, this is where the buy-in comes to this, selling the idea or demonstrating this has value to the potential teacher, because it's a lot of work that doesn't immediately show up in the classroom. It does show up, but not in a way, this is not a handout you give students. This is the clarifying your own thinking so that it's effective when you come to the classroom to build the curriculum.
So with a concept map, for instance, you're not particularly asking a student to generate concept maps or showing them your concept map. This was part of the intentionality beforehand, that if a student wanted to see it, yeah, this thing exists, but it exists for your benefit. And concept mapping per se as a skill might be peripheral to what we're trying to accomplish in this course. But building a network of concepts in the student brain is not peripheral, and having thought through what are the logically connected paths that need to be developed is part of what gives intentionality to the curriculum.
Yes.
Some people hearing this are probably thinking, but where's the home for the facts? Like, aren't facts important? Indeed, most courses are a presentation of fact after fact after fact. So are your students impoverished in terms of assimilating facts that are, part of the meat of the discipline?
Well, it seems like that, of course, from the surface, you might say that, looking at the perspective. But, again, we start to say, what are the facts? Well, they're the products of thinking. And the value is in the thinking, not in the facts. It's not that the facts have no value, it's that they're the product, they're the end point. They're not the beginning, or they're not what the students need to be able to do. The students and the teacher generally incorporate the facts into the structure automatically, naturally, and even arrive at the same types of facts, or even the same facts by themselves through their own thinking. If we can teach students to own the process of producing the facts instead of just the facts, then the facts are not there. They're just not the focus. And most of the time what I find in my class and working through the SITS model is that the facts come naturally, and I don't have to memorize them because they automatically belong. They're there, they're just they're not in the limelight, they're not the focus, but they're not there. So it's a little hard to grapple with, but yeah, most of the facts are what we would call particulars. They're not universals. Mm-hmm. And the particulars don't have value without the universals. And that's the problem when students come into the classroom. If all they see are the particulars, they don't know why they have value or why they matter. Thus, they do not commit them to memory. Whereas if you teach them the thinking process, they have the universals to make sense of the particulars, to hold on to them longer, hopefully for lifetime, but we'll have limited memories. But yeah, I don't think they're short on facts. They may not be able to instantaneously recall trivia that people might ask them, but as the need demands, they can derive the types of facts they need for given situations and problems, the actual application of real life, as opposed to Jeopardy or something.
Trivial Pursuit, or whatever.
Yes, whatever your flavor is.
Okay. So how does track 3, which is, we often call it substantive assessment, how does it serve to ensure that what we've espoused here as our desire for the student is actually happening?
So track 3 is a little more complicated in terms of application. In communication, the application is broad. So we have lots of, the second leg of the stool, we have lots of options that are variable but very, very good. We get to the assessment side and it becomes very difficult. It's the least developed part of SITS. And it's easy to say this type of information recall is not effective in assessing thinking. That's easy. It's hard to say, well, what is effective in assessing teaching? Is it essays? Could be, but it could also not be. We can kid ourselves. And so this is the accountability side, the assessment side. How do we hold ourselves and our students accountable for the model we talk about? We want them to think. But our natural bent, maybe their natural bent, is not to think because it's easier. So how do we hold everybody accountable at the same time? And that becomes difficult because you can design really good assessments and then kind of find yourself sinking to the lowest level of teaching those assessments instead of teaching the thinking. Or on the other side, you can design recall tests that are only asking, did you remember? Which is not unimportant, but again, that's not the focus. Because you can remember and still not grapple with the thinking, still not understand, if I could say it that way. So this side is trying to grapple with how do we do this? And on this side, by this point in time in SITS, most people are mature enough to be able to say, okay, we're all kind of on the same plane here. We're all still reaching for what's the best way to do this, and it's going to vary from class to class, from discipline to discipline. It may even vary from student to student. How do I approach this? And so it's much more a matter of we're all in this together, trying to help one another understand this, and we can all agree certain things just don't work well. But what does work best is going to vary, and that becomes it's very encouraging, it's very helpful, it's very challenging because we see that there is still a problem. How do we best assess this? And there isn't a one-off answer or solution. But there are patterns again. There are things that work well and things that don't. There are things that force a student to think through a problem, and then there are things that, generally speaking, they're just not effective. So that's helpful.
In a sense, if we're on target, if we have alignment between what we say we're doing in the classroom and what we're actually assessing, then we're asking students to demonstrate that metacognition on a significant level has happened because they're being asked to do things that were never explicitly delivered to them in the form that we're now asking. So very often that shows up as an application of one sort or another.
Right.
That we left them with the tools to be able to negotiate this extended step, but we've never taken the step with them. But we think that if metacognition has been successful, they actually are positioned so that they can successfully take that step. Students have various reactions, but I would ask you what are most students' reactions to when we've done it well, and we don't always do it well, but when we've done it well, when we've prepared students to take this step of application, and they recognize over and over again, that's what assessment is going to be about. How do they respond?
Well, I say there's probably a spectrum, and with two extremes. And one extreme would be they collapse and they fold. And they basically say, now this depends, of course, on your course. I teach a core course. And in a core course, everybody takes it, but it's not what anybody is doing in their major per se. So there's a bit of resistance there. And in a core course, you'll have people who will just say, this is a lot of work. I don't think it's worth it. I'll just take it again. So that, and it's kind of sad. How do you reach those people? That's always a challenge. But that's not the majority. That's far and away the minority. And in major courses, that's actually rare. Usually what happens is there's initial resistance and frustration, followed by an immense amount of gratitude, an immense amount of satisfaction in learning that I can now do things. It's not just that, I have head knowledge, I can recall facts, but I can actually operate in this area. Maybe, at a lower level than expertise per se, but I can operate, and I can show that I can operate. It's very satisfying. And you've experienced this, I've experienced this, students coming back and saying, thank you, that really made a difference. I can now think in the field. I have something that is a gain, and that gain, even if I'm not doing that as a profession, lasts well after graduation, that I have this gain that's of value, and I see that, and I can use it, and I do use it. So we usually get initial pushback, initial frustration. Well, this is hard. Most classes still don't ask us to rise to this level, but they usually rise to the occasion, and they are usually very grateful afterwards that they were able to do so.
Yeah, so that's kind of an unexpected turn when we raise the bar, as it were, that there's a gratitude that the bar has been raised. Read recently a study of college graduates and their anticipation of what their first job would pay, and they overshot greatly about what they were going to get paid.
Surprise, surprise.
But more than half of them said the college experience that they were just completing was not worth it. It did not return on the investment of 4 years and lots of money, that they felt like on some level they were leaving without the equipment necessary to be successful in the job place.
Right.
And we would view that with our model here as morally reprehensible. Like, we represent that we're doing something that ought to have real world value. And students actually appreciate the challenge when they realize it's been thoughtfully constructed and not an arbitrary game, and that it does have real world consequences. Well, thanks for talking today, David.
Thanks, Mike.
And appreciate the discussion and your work in the classroom. If you're interested in learning more about the work of the Summer Institute in Teaching Science, please go to my website, deepanddurable.com. That's deep, A-N-D, durable.com for more details. Deep and Durable Learning is supported by the Science and Engineering Endowment Fund. Please consider a monetary gift to the Science and Engineering Endowment Fund to allow us to continue to produce the resources that are most helpful to you. You can give through a link at deepanddurable.com.